4, verse 6. Let your speech always be with grace,
seasoned with salt,
so that you may know how to answer each person. It all started 10 years ago when my mother started an ICC chapter. Even though I was only 5, so I wasn't technically old enough to participate, she let me join. Because how are you going to keep a 5-year-old occupied alone in his room for 2 hours? I continued to be in ICC for the next 6 years until I was old enough to join the Young Speakers Bureau curriculum, when I was 11 years old.
And 1 year later, I joined ICC, and since then, Elijah and I have done the YSG journey together. Now, I'm sure you have a lot of questions about ICC, the YSG curriculum, and many more. So we're here today to answer your questions, to show you what we've learned and what we've experienced along the way.
I started my YSG 1 portfolio on September 14th, 2020. And I had been in ICC for 6 years already, so I was very ready to get out of the younger group and start going with the big kids. And I was ready to finish my portfolio in record time.
But Elijah, it took you 2 years to finish your YSG 1 portfolio. That's twice as long as it took me.
Yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't ready to do the paperwork, no matter how easy it was. For example, this is the first page of the portfolio. Now, you may notice 2 things. 1, there's some random scribbles, but 2, I read this page 2 years after I started my portfolio. It took me 2 years to just read a page. Additionally, looking back through my portfolio, for the first 6 months, the only thing I was able to complete was 4 impromptus. So it's safe to say I wasn't going to be setting any speed records.
Impromptu is the first thing we learned in our YSG journey. Impromptu is hard, especially for the younger students, but it is good practice for doing hard things. In impromptu, you are given a topic and 1 minute to prepare and 2 minutes to present. And
these topics aren't like, hey Grace, what do you have for breakfast? No. These topics are more like, explain a wise man will hear an increase in knowledge.
Not all the impromptu topics are that hard.
But still, the first time that I gave an impromptu, I lasted about 20 seconds, and that was it. But the more and more that I did them, and the 16 practices that I did, I started getting better and better, and now I'm a lot more comfortable speaking on the spot and having a conversation with someone. And after that, I decided to do a storytelling because the tournament was coming up and I really wanted to do a speech for the ICC tournament. And so I decided to skip the first 2 speeches and go straight to speech number 3, which is a storytelling speech. But even with this sudden burst of motivation, I still didn't do the paperwork because I could just come back to it later. What could go wrong, I thought. And that was all I finished in my whole first year of YSG.
So when I joined in the fall of 2021, I was able to catch up with Elijah very quickly.
And finally, with a new friend to go along with, I started on the first speech, which is speech number 1, hello, my name is.
This speech is designed to help students get comfortable with writing speeches, as well as introduce them to the 6-step formula.
This is what we use to write every speech. We start with the purpose. Why am I giving a speech? Or what can I learn while going through the process of writing and practicing this speech?
The next step is prepare. The researching, the writing, the practicing, and scheduling all the platforms to give your speech.
And the third step is present. You give the speech and you make sure you find some people to fill out evaluation forms.
Now, you may have noticed that all 3 of these steps start with the letter P. For this reason, we call them P-Q'd.
And now that we had learned these steps, it was time to actually do them. For me, writing my hello, my name is was pretty easy because you didn't actually need to do this speech in the community, you only needed to practice it in chapter. And I had also written a speech very similar to this only a year before, so I made some revisions and I was done.
Unfortunately, when I went to write the speech, it didn't go quite as smoothly. I didn't think there was that much to tell. But thankfully, with some advice from coaches, I was able to get it done.
And that brings us to speech number 2, which is my favorite Bible verse, or Bame-Bloomer for short. This speech is pretty simple. You tell about your favorite Bible verse. Wow.
But something important is not to get hung up on the word favorite. I remember when I started writing the speech, I thought, how am I going to pick just one? But a coach mentored me and told me to pick one that was meaningful to me, not my actual favorite. So I chose the verse of Jeremiah 17:7, which says, "Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him." This verse reminds me to put my trust in the Lord because he knows best.
And I chose Philippians 4, verse 6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. I was often nervous about messing up or making a mistake in front of others, but this verse reminded me that it didn't really matter and I should bring any nervousness to the Lord.
And that brings us to speech number 3, the storytelling.
And if you remember, I already did this speech, so I was way ahead of Grace and could go ahead and finish YSG 1, right? Well, if you remember, I didn't do any of the paperwork, and for another thing, I did this speech 1 year ago, and tournament was coming up again. I wanted to do a speech at tournament pretty bad, so I decided to do a completely different storytelling. For this time, I did a story called The Kind Stranger, which is just the story of the Good Samaritan.
For my storytelling speech, I chose the story called The Queen Who Saved Her People. It is the story of Queen Esther. Thankfully, the story was relatively short, so I was able to memorize it quickly, but I had no idea how hard it would be to get the characters right. I knew what I wanted to do going in, but boy, I was not prepared for switching between different characters. But something I remember about this speech was that the audience was so invested in what I had to say. This was the first time that anyone had ever cared to listen to me. I learned the value of pursuing my audience before preparing a speech.
Remember that 6-step formula we talked about earlier? Well, now that we've given all the speeches in YSG 1, it's time to do the next 3 steps, which is RQ. The 3 steps after you give your speeches.
The first step is rate. You receive evaluations and you evaluate yourself.
Next is respond.
Everyone's favorite step.
You thank everyone who's helped you with the speech.
And you send a lot of thank you notes.
And lastly, we have record, which is pretty simple if you've done all the previous steps correctly. You just double check that you've actually done everything and you put all the evaluation forms, the script, and everything else that you can nicely in your portfolio.
These 6 steps make us competent, character-driven communicators.
Or C cubed for short. So in YSG, what we learn is P cubed plus R cubed equals C cubed.
And now we have finished phase 1 in YSG. I was able to finish on October 27th, 2022.
And I finished a little bit later on November 10th, 2022.
That brings us to YSG 2.
And for this one, I actually did it in the correct order this time, and I started with the first speech, speech number 4, which is informative speaking.
This speech requires you to use visual aids. I did my speech about the cello. I got to bring my cello to every platform and show different parts on it. I even brought it all the way to Tennessee for a tournament. One of the coolest things was I remember the students were so interested about the cello and wanted me to show them everything about it.
But my speech was a little bit easier to fit the visual aid in my pocket because my speech was about a yo-yo.
Safe to say, Elijah had a lot of fun doing his speech, and he even got invited to the international tournament.
Unfortunately, I didn't win the tournament, but I learned a lot from doing this speech, including how to research effectively. I also took away the lesson that it's important to keep improving on and building your speech to make it better, not just settle with the first draft.
And I learned how to quickly and effectively set up and tear down my visual aid without taking away from my audience's time.
And now we're to speech number 5, which is a literary interpretation, or LI for short.
An LI is sort of like a storytelling from YSG 1, except you add an introduction and it's a little bit longer. For this speech, I chose Ladybug Girl and Bumblebee Boy. It's a fun, upbeat story about 2 kids playing at the playground. Unfortunately, when I went to give this speech, I gave it to mostly adults. Even though I thought they wouldn't enjoy my speech, they actually gave me great encouragement and feedback.
my run with this speech went a little less smoothly because I decided that for a speech with a 7-minute time limit, I decided to do The Great Elephant, which is a story that takes at least 15 minutes to read. So I just thought, oh, I'll just cut it at about half, and that'll get it down to 7 minutes. Well, little did I know just how much I would have to cut. I cut, and I cut, and I cut 3 pages worth of words out of the speech, and it was still too long. So I cut some more and eventually was able to get it down to 9 minutes, which is still 2 minutes over the time limit. But I had to deal with it. I had no problems finding places to give this speech, and I gave it at a senior center and a preschool. This speech produced one of my favorite moments in my whole 10 years of ICC. When I gave it for the preschool, afterwards, several kids said, "That was amazing. He should come back with a new story every week." This moment was really cool because I was able to present the speech so well and bring it to life that they wanted me to tell them more stories. And that's one of the coolest things that's ever happened to me.
Something that I discovered while doing this speech was sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. The audience enjoyed my speech because it was something I was interested in. There's a famous quote in ICC that I love. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
And now we've done all the speeches in YSG2, so we just had a little bit more paperwork to do and we were done.
Even so, we waited about 6 months to finish our YSG2 because the school year ended. I was able to finish on November 16th, 2023.
And I finished a little later on November 23rd, 2023. Are you starting to see a pattern?
And now it was time for YSG3, and we were so excited to start.
And the first speech is the testimony.
This speech is notorious for taking people months, even years to write.
And we wanted to gild before the end of the year. So we were determined, and we did the only logical thing to make sure that we would 100% gild in time.
We skipped it.
And moved on to speech number 8.
The current event speech.
This speech, we decided to both do a computer-assisted presentation, or CAP for short. I did mine on solar and wind energy because I thought I could make a pretty interesting speech out of it. And I had some good ideas for slides. It was also the first speech that came to mind, and because I procrastinated, I only had 2 weeks to write the speech because you guessed it, tournament.
I also only had 2 weeks to write my CAP speech on the disconnect of technology.
But she was still able to write a great speech, and this is my favorite part.
So, the only solution here is to burn all the phones. Just kidding. Technology is not the problem. Actually, phones can be used for great good. It is just how we use them that is a problem. Larry Roxon at Harvard Business says that one of the best ways to break through phone addiction is by keeping technology in designated areas. You might have a house rule that no phones are allowed at the dinner table or in the living room. Separating ourselves from technology can only be beneficial. Another great way to limit ourselves is by setting specific screen time restrictions. Our phones actually have this built in for us. You might only allow 30 minutes on Instagram or have your phone shut down at 10 p.m. It is up to you, but it is there for the using. We are humans that need genuine connection, and you simply cannot get that from a counterfeit duplicate.
This speech was a lot of fun to do, and I learned a lot.
Something that I discovered while preparing this speech was that making a slide deck isn't as hard as it looks. Look at me using slides right there.
And what I learned is that even though you've written a script, there's still a lot you can change about the speech. And if you ask anyone who's seen my CAP a lot of times, they would tell you it's different every single time I do it. I had written my CAP in December of 2023. So when tournament rolled around again in March, I had a speech to do for tournament, but I hadn't written another one. And my mom said, "Hey, you really need to start working harder if you want to gild before the end of the year. You should write your speech number 9. Speech number 9 is a speech where you get to choose. You ask 3 mentors and ask them what they think you should do as your speech." So I asked them, and I got 3 different responses. One suggested a literary interp, one suggested an audio podcast, and one suggested a cultural storyteller.
A cultural storytelling is a duo speech where students take a culture-rich story and bring it to life while adding extra cultural elements.
But I really wanted to do an audio podcast because I had never done one before and it sounded like so much fun. And a CS was probably the hardest speech that I could have done. And for one, it's a duo speech. And how am I supposed to find a partner who's also going to tournament, available to meet in person all the time, and can tolerate working with me? Oh, okay. So I still wanted to do an audio podcast, so I sent her an email and said, hey, we can do this if you want. We only have about 2 weeks to write it. I'm sure you're busy, so only if you want to. Please say no.
Elijah, I would love to do a cultural storytelling with you.
And that's what she responded with. So we started on the scary process of writing a cultural storytelling in about a week.
For this story, we chose Just the Same Inside by Grace Pretty Moon and Ruth K. Hobbs.
She-Wall came close to the shawl and felt it with her fingers. It was as soft as it looked and very warm.
You will buy it, Mother?
No, my little one. We must exchange pottery today for food and not for the things we do not need.
But we need a shawl. This shawl. You know my mother, that you need it.
Traditionally, these shawls were like blankets. The Indian women would wear them as dresses or use them as mantelpieces as well as shawls.
However, it was very uncommon to see a shawl with two different colors.
We will speak of it no more. We have money for food only, my daughter.
And she spoke to the trader about the food, sugar, and grain that she needed.
She-Wall stood looking at the shawl, and above all the thoughts turning in her mind, she repeated her resolution.
My mother shall have this soft, beautiful, warm shawl.
This speech was quite an adventure.
Including the fact that we had over 9 minutes of story before we even added the cultural elements. Thankfully, we were able to cut it down and keep it within the allotted time. Maybe one day Elijah will learn his lesson about keeping stories short.
Probably not. What I learned from this speech is that it's always valuable to have multiple opinions. A second and third opinion can be very nice. Especially when working on blocking, having a lot of people to give us advice was very helpful and really brought the speech to another level.
Something that I learned from this speech was that it's so much more fun to do things as a team. We get to make decisions and decide what to do, but we do it together. You have people to support and back you up.
And that brings us back to speech number 7, the testimony.
Remember how we were talking about how long that takes people to write?
I've heard stories of it taking 2 or 3 times the amount of other speeches, sometimes a full year.
But we were determined to get it done, and since this ceremony was already scheduled, we just had to do it.
And I was the first to knock it out. And I have to say, it's really not that bad as long as you have a direction to go in. I was able to finish this speech in about 6 days, and what really helped me the most is speech number 2, my favorite Bible verse. Because the topics were very similar. They were both about fearing failure and not letting it control what you do.
This is my personal favorite part of Elijah's speech.
After these years of losses, I began to be frustrated. I thought that because I was talented, that means I'm supposed to be the best. And if I'm not, then I failed. But slowly, God has shifted my mindset. I recently heard a quote that really stuck with me. It's simply, failure is just not trying. If you never try to succeed, then you never will, so you fail. This made me realize that if I want to be the best, I'll have to try hard and put in the work, not just be talented. And even if I do that, you will still make mistakes and you will still lose. And that's hard to accept. You have to learn to make a mistake, learn from the mistake, and then the hardest part, forget the mistake and not let it control what you did.
Unfortunately, when I went about this speech, it didn't go quite as smoothly as Elijah. Before I finished, I probably wrote about 3 different testimonies. The first time I went about it, it didn't feel like me or my story. So I deleted the entire thing and started over. But with some advice from coaches around me, I was able to write something like this. A few years ago, a friend asked me, how does Jesus affect your life? As a believer herself, she was just asking the general question. And so I answered, well, he saved me and redeemed me. and that seemed to satisfy him enough, so we moved on. But I got to thinking, shouldn't my relationship with Christ be affecting my life more than just that? Obviously, salvation and redemption have eternal implications, but how does that affect how I really live? I have always been challenged by Peter's words to be ready to speak. In 1 Peter 3:15, he says, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give a reason to every man that asketh you for the hope that you have with meekness and fear." Always be ready to give an answer. Clearly, at that moment, I wasn't ready. I thought that when somebody asked me that, I would have all the answers and I know exactly what to say. You can see how well that worked out. But the Lord used that conversation and showed me that in my own power, I can do nothing.
We were both able to give our speeches for a Zoom call community platform for quite a few people.
And we were also able to give it in conversation form to 2 adults. This part was my favorite because it felt more real and raw. Also, it was a lot easier to tell one person instead of a whole bunch of people. I discovered that people want to hear your story. You just have to be willing to tell them.
If you've been paying attention and counting, you may now notice that we have done every speech except for speech number 10.
And if you were really paying attention, you may have noticed that we've only given 8 speeches.
That's true. We skipped speech number 6. If you're wondering about that, that's because speech number 6 doesn't exist.
And now that brings us to this speech, speech number 10,
The Guild Speech, where we share with you our journey.
and what we've learned along the way.
Thank you for coming along with us.
If I were to leave you with one thing, it would be this. You have a voice and a story to tell. Let the Lord use you to share what He has given you. Always be ready to give an answer.
And I would say that it's not all about where you end up when working on something. I learned more from being in a time crunch, having a couple days to finish a speech or a couple weeks to finish a whole portfolio. That's the times that I grew the most. And I think if you would ask any adult in here, they would say that having a lot to do and not a lot of time is pretty realistic for real life.
We've talked successes, failures, and everything in between.
And we'd like to leave you with what we started with.
Colossians 4:6. Let your speech always be with grace,
Seasoned with salt,
that you may know.
how to answer each person.
We know we aren't perfect,
In fact, we're very far from it.
but we're still learning,
And growing in our walk with Christ.
and we're getting
Ready to speak.